Look, if it's possible, we want a non-Indigenous person to come and speak, and we want a non-Indigenous woman to come and speak. Come with us.
Come here. Islami. Come and stand with us. Okay guys, it's been a long journey, hasn't it? It's been a lot of years for these guys here, these Indigenous guys. And it's been a journey that us white honkies, I call us, white honkies have been on for a little while now since we got our eyes open to what was really going on. And I've apologised to these people once before down at the National Library on a live stream, saying that I was an uneducated honky. I had no idea what these guys were fighting, and I never did. But I do now. Alright, and I think we've all been educated a hell of a lot, okay, into what has gone on and how far this Luciferian takeover, you know, and the land council rights, and the crap flags they made everyone, and everything else they've done to us, you know what I mean? Just to divide you.
Just to divide us. Their religions, everything, folks, was out because they knew down the line it was going to divide us. Well, we're here for non-division, guys. All right, and I tip my hat to Bruce and his dad, Womajan. Okay, everybody else in this movement that is working towards it, guys. All right, this is what we need to do. All right, we can't do it alone. The honkies can't do it. We've proved that for a friggin' 1,000 years, right? We're idiots. All right, we can't do it. All right, these guys can't do it because they've been persecuted for thousands of years.
We do it together.
We
We
do
walk
it
in
together.
truth. We
Exactly.
walk in truth together.
So yeah, if I've got anything to say from the white honkies, if that's my little role here, it is that we love you brothers and sisters and aunties and uncles, and we want to share this time with you, and we want to walk forward in your sovereignty that you will allow us to walk in. Because we are not sovereign of this land. We need you people to accept us to walk in our sovereignty upon your land. So I just want to thank yourself for being here, Bruce. I want to thank you for the invite. And yeah, I couldn't think of any place to be better on a Sunday afternoon with a bunch of people that are trying to take this world to a better place. So that's it from you.
Guys, I just want to just have a little bit of education. It's something I learned at university, and I had to do an assignment about 18 months ago. So it was quite, I'm sure it was quite weird for me to be in this position now after writing this. So the legal doctrine terra nullius, land of no one, was used as a basis for the British Empire's Commonwealth taking of Indigenous sovereignty and land.
With fraud.
I would argue, as monumentous as the Mabo versus Queensland No. 2 case was for the Indigenous sovereignty, what ensued in the subsequent years through the Howard government and 10-point plan policy repeats ideology ingrained in the ruling class since colonisation. Despite the High Court decision rejecting the claim of terra nullius in Mabo versus Queensland No. 2 case, the decision has not manifested into Australian and legal environments which result in real change for the Australian Indigenous community. With examples throughout our history, I'll aim to show why the effects of terra nullius doctrine are still with us today. The Australia we live in has protected its own colonial interests via neoliberalist ideals and dated legal constructs since colonisation. Representations of law reform for Indigenous sovereignty that have been made after the Mabo versus Queensland No. 2 case, such as Native Title Act 1993, has made little improvement to their relative socio-economic status according to the standard social indicators. Research conducted by the Senate Standing Committee on Community Affairs between 2002 and 2004. One could argue it is because anything of inherent significance would undermine all social constructs the Australian colonial system has built over the last 200 years. Australians have been indoctrinated as a young culture with racism through a conduit of formal and informal policies. Our history shows examples like the Immigration Restriction Act 1901, in the White Australian policy, the Yellow Peril, Populate or Perish campaign, all the assimilation policies that led to the Stolen Generation. White supremacy ideologies and then immigration propagandist narratives that followed have had a long-lasting effects towards the racism that still exists in this country today. those policies and campaigns were not solely directed towards Indigenous people of Australia, but to all non-whites as time went on. As New South Wales Premier Sir Henry Parkes coined the term in 1890, the crimson thread of kinship, when referring to immigration policies and not losing Australia's whiteness. Much can be derived by that mentality of the leaders in that era and how it has flowed on to the present day. Racism and violence shown towards Indigenous people at the beginning of colonisation of Australia has well been documented.
Genocide.
They were falsely perceived as having no societal governing structure in place to which a leader with authority could sign treaties with the settlers.
Fraudulent claims.
What ensued was the land being fictitiously claimed as terra nullius, paving the way for the theft and atrocities against Australia's first people.
Genocide.
The land was taken through violence to start with, and then as time went on, the use of European legal constructs culminated in the legal dispossession of the land from Australia's first peoples. Interestingly, explorer and grazier John Bateman in 1835 tried to use a treaty to buy land directly from the Indigenous inhabitants around the Port Phillip Bay area in Melbourne. It is said to be the only example in Australian history that an effort of treaty was made by European instead of just taking the land by force.
Genocide.
John Bateman's story captures a side of Australian society that at that time might have been trying to be civil in negotiating with Australia's first peoples. However, New South Wales Governor Sir Richard Burke's proclamation on the 10th of October that same year stated that people found dwelling on land without authority of the government could be considered trespassers.
False claims.
Legislation clearly aimed at the native community. This proclamation quashed John Bateman's treaty and any subsequent treaties which in turn codified the concept of terra nullius. Indigenous people therefore could not sell land, nor could individuals therefore acquire it, except directly through the Crown. This is a clear example of how Indigenous people of Australia have been removed from their lands by the way of European legal constructs, resulting in the legal dispossession of their land, which sheds light on why the effects are still with us today.
Genocide.
We then reflect on Phil Griffin's study of Queensland's Chinese Immigration Regulations Act. In 1877, he concluded that ruling class agendas influenced opinions on the Chinese because ruling classes pressured parliaments composed of members from ruling classes. The colonists treated Australia's first people in much the same vein. The colonial legal system was designed and has been used for colonial advantage since colonisation. The traditional English linguistic structure that the law has been constructed with also facilitates a political class, the 21st century ruling class, to use multiple interpretations of the wording of law to best suit their given agendas. In the case of Kruger Bray versus the Commonwealth 1997, an example is given of how Australian laws were written for the coloniser's best interest at heart and not of the native person by the reasoning of Justice Dawson provided. He stated in his ruling that the Genocide Convention was not incorporated into Australian law. Therefore, the Ordinance of Northern Territory 1918 is the legal basis for his decision. Furthermore, he said that the Ordinance did not constitute intent to destroy because the precise wording of the statute in the Ordinance stated in the best interests of the child. The decisions, I believe, is at the heart of the Indigenous struggle in a legal system that was imposed onto them, which has also positioned itself as the almighty and accept no other notions of law. We also know now know that it is we also now know that it is in the best interest of any child to be with their own families, learning whatever culture they might originate from, provided they are in a safe environment. The High Court considered the legislation, in fact, devoid of its ideological, social and historical context. Therefore, colonial interests could be further protected. I do question if we had a majority of an Indigenous Justices of the High Court of Australia out of the 7 appointed, whether the wording would be interpreted differently. Branches of the ruling British family tree still exist at the top of Australian power structure to this day, clearly with English surnames. The current Liberal government led by Scott Morrison has 60 federal ministers. There is one Indigenous minister in the party, the Honourable Minister Ken Wyatt. I believe that if Indigenous Australians are to have a real voice in Parliament, which would influence change to the status quo of their people, the odds of 60 to 1 need to be improved. Simply using the representation of an Indigenous people in the Cabinet we have in Parliament today, Indigenous people are 60 to 1 odds before they undertake any meaningful change compared to the non-Indigenous person, which has odds of 59 out of 60. Thus, the Indigenous population continue to have little to no influence on the overall decisions of the country or meaningful change for their own people under British legal construct. Change that has been attempted by non-Indigenous Australians in Parliament has never worked when looking at the issue of Indigenous growth holistically. If anything, they have made things worse. One could question if that has been perpetrated on purpose. We can find some answers for Indigenous representation in Parliament predicament by critically thinking about Australia's 4 socio-economic classes: welfare class, blue-collar working class, white-collar executive class and political class. The political class is most relevant to Professor Watson's question because Australia's hierarchical social systems have been designed and implemented since colonisation to help protect and advantage the political class. This is by virtue of rule of law. It is a fundamental component to sustaining the aristocratical construct of the political class, which is historically a British ideology through kinship.
Fraud and fiction on this land.
The political class, like all other employment classes, helps his own next of kin to get into as lucrative and powerful positions as afforded to them. Much like a plumber would ask his electrician friend if he could give his son an apprenticeship. It is a natural phenomenon of opportunity through association. It also gives insight as to why things do not seem to change for the Indigenous community as a collective. Conclusively, Indigenous Australians are not represented sufficiently in more powerful positions of our modern society. A simple reason for this could be that they do not have access to the same level of private education afforded to non-Indigenous Australians, which is where most of our leaders are educated and derived from. That's all right, one more. When we look back on our history, we can see blatantly how racist the colonialists were to Australia's first people and how they carried out that mentally through the last 2 centuries. The white supremacy ideology extended far beyond colonisation of Australia's first people and carried through the ages to all non-whites. The British legal system was used to construct policies that protected a white Australia ideology, and when the ruling class felt threatened, either racially or economically, by Indigenous Australians or foreigners, it used its own law mechanisms to quash competition in favour of their own vested interests. For Australia's first people to still feel the effects in society today of our legal dispossession and physical deprivation is to know that the fight for Australia's first people's sovereignty is still far from over.
Go away.